He's one of the youngest candidates in the State House of Representatives and the youngest candidate running for governor this year. After a career in the Foreign Service, he moved back to his home in St. Tammany Parish. He says that he wants to make a generational transformative change, and he wants to take on the dinosaurs in Baton Rouge. Today on the Louisianist, Representative Richard Nelson. Hello, bonjour. We are here in Lafayette with a candidate for governor, Representative Richard Nelson from the North Shore, from St. Tammany Parish. And today we're going to talk about a little about his background and his career, as well as his plans and proposals for becoming governor. Hello, bonjour.
Bonjour.
How's it going?
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for making the time for us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So to get started, could you talk to us a little bit about your upbringing, where you're from, where you went to school?
Yeah, sure. So grew up in Mandeville, the North Shore Lake Pontchartrain. Went to Mandeville High, was actually valedictorian at Mandeville High. I was an Eagle Scout. Went to LSU after that, got a degree in biological engineering. Did it in 3 years, so I hadn't had enough LSU football. Went to LSU Law School after that. Then after 3 years in law school, joined the Foreign Service of the U.S. Department of State. So moved to Washington and then moved all around the world. My wife and I met at LSU, got married, and she came with me all around the world. So it was a kind of a fortuitous event for both of us, maybe. And then we started having kids when we were actually in the Republic of Georgia was my second or third assignment. And so it's a former Soviet republic, kind of South Russia a little bit. And then now we have 3 children, 3 boys, 9, 7, and 5. And we moved back to Mandeville in 2017. I started my own consulting company. I've been doing project management consulting and also an attorney. So I do some legal work as well. But I got elected to the legislature in 2019, and I've been serving in the legislature since then.
Awesome. And I think it's kind of a rare background for a state legislator to have been a diplomat. Are there any other ones? I don't think so.
No,
right?
I don't think so. Right. No, it's a little different path. I mean, I really wanted to go see the world, and I think also, serve my country to some extent. And I think that was something that was important to me, and it was a really great opportunity. I mean, I saw a lot of the world. Also learned a lot of skills. I mean, I think. Diplomacy is one of those things that's sometimes lost in the hustle and bustle of the state legislature. But, when you really have to bring people together, those are things that I think I bring to the table, because you have to get agreement on politics is the art of the possible. If you can't get everybody to agree on it, it doesn't happen. So right. It served me well, I think, in the legislature. And then I think also is that, traveling around the world and seeing everything, you really see the difference that good government makes in people's lives. You drive across a border and you go from everybody having electricity, having opportunity, having jobs to, nothing. Some places you drive across the border and they're right back to, 1,500 years ago. They're basically having the same existence. So I think we have similar challenges in Louisiana. I mean, if you look across the border into Texas, you have a state where people live 3.5 years longer and they make 33% more in income. And there's a huge disparity because of this invisible line where, geography is relatively similar, the people are relatively similar. At the same time, I think the structure of government is what causes that disparity. So you right. see that going around the world, what a difference it makes.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And where else were you based in addition to Georgia?
So I was in Washington, D.C., and then also Frankfurt, Germany.
Okay,
and
cool.
So we kind of and I traveled all around in that time too, so I wasn't always there. I spent, unfortunately, a lot of time in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, those kind of nice vacation places. I went nice places too, but it gave me a good opportunity to travel and kind of work around the world. I think I've worked in probably at least 30 different countries for the State Department, and like I said, lived in at least 2.
Cool. And then last question before we talk about coming back to Louisiana. Does your experience in Georgia give you a special perspective or unique perspective on everything that's happening with the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine?
Yeah. So Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and that was kind of Vladimir Putin's first foray into trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, I guess, is his idea. But the country's been occupied by the Russian army since then. So about a third of the country, I think, currently is occupied, and it was that way when I was there, when I lived there as well. I think it was something we discussed almost every day at the embassy. I mean, it's not an academic discussion when the country you're living in is actually occupied by the Russians, right? And I think while I was there, actually, he invaded Ukraine. He took Crimea. And so it was always on everybody's mind, and it's been around for a long time. And I think as far as, the challenges of the next, 10 years, I think that's going to be one of the defining moments is how the Ukraine conflict gets resolved, who comes out on top. So But it is interesting. Your scope and your perspective on things is different when you've actually experienced it.
Definitely. And I thought it was interesting what you said about how being abroad sometimes, I learned some languages, spent some time abroad when I was younger during college, and sometimes people think it's unrelated to what I do now in Louisiana, but I feel very similarly that definitely less international experience than you, but that it helps you inform how important it is to have like the democratic and constitutional institutions we have here in the United States and in Louisiana. And so you definitely, when you live in either an unfree country or a country that's trying its best to become free, you really realize how much we take for granted here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for example, Georgia, obviously was part of the Soviet Union until, the early 90s. And so they're basically one generation away from, essentially a communist dictatorship. And actually Stalin was Georgian, and so he's, relatively popular figure there still, but at the same time, they look back on the Soviet Union and they recognize, the disparity in, what the quality of life that they had back then and what they have now. But it's an interesting comparison. But it's funny because the Louisiana legislature, I say a lot, it's probably more like the UN than it's like a normal state legislature because people speak French on the floor of the House all the time. I mean, I think the geographic diversity and the kind of cultural diversity of Louisiana is very, very strong. So one corner is completely different from the other. I'm from Mandeville. My wife's from Shreveport, and Acadiana is obviously completely different. So it's very interesting for a smaller state to have such diversity. I think, and from a cultural aspect, makes it, I think, more like I said, the UN or something like that versus your general state legislature. I don't think Iowa has that level of diversity.
I was going to say Ohio.
Yeah.
No offense to those states. Okay, so then why did you, I think another important thing about your history is that you had the opportunity to stay outside of Louisiana. Some people would think being a diplomat is more exciting than coming back and living on the North Shore. So what was your decision? I wouldn't say that, but some people might. A lot of my friends, they want to move away from Louisiana, and I'm sure you have the same situation with Texas, et cetera. It's important that we reverse the brain drain. And so why did you decide to come back home?
Yeah, so it's a couple of things. I mean, one is, I started having children, so I think I wanted to come back. My parents still live in Mandeville. I wanted to be closer to my family, but I wanted them to, and honestly, I wanted my kids to kind of have similar experience to me growing up, which I think most people that have moved away, most of my friends from high school or college, they have that same desire, I think. But I mean, more importantly for me was that I feel like it's my job to fix the problems here. I'm an engineer, I want to fix the problem, but I think if most of the people that I think are capable of fixing it, if they leave, it's not going to help anything. So I mean, I feel like I have the ability to help, I feel like I have the ability to fix it, and I felt like I had a duty to do that. This is my home, if I don't fight for it, who will? And so that was one of the main things that brought me back. Being a diplomat is a lot of fun. I mean, it's a pretty adventurous life. I've been, I like to say I've lived a couple lifetimes. I'm only 37, I've lived a couple lifetimes in that 37 years. But I think that there's significant challenges in Louisiana, and I think the people are suffering under bad government here, and that's why I wanted to come back.
Right. And so after moving home, you were working in Mandeville, and then eventually decided to run for office. And so what was that thought process? I guess it was somewhat similar. What was, did you talk to your family? It's kind of it's a different lifestyle, of course, being a politician.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, my wife is kind of the boss, probably like most wives, and so she was the one that I had to get on board with it, and I think that there was just kind of an opportunity where the current state rep was running for Senate, so it was an open seat. And she helped me significantly. I mean, she went with me. We knocked on like 5,000 doors in order to get elected, so she had a lot of buy-in in the process. And it was my hometown. I didn't really have much connection there. I'd been gone for a long time from between college and the Foreign Service. But, the message just resonated. We went out and worked hard, even though we didn't have that much money, and, still don't have that much money. That's just them's the breaks. But it was one of those situations where the opportunity was there and we just had to work for it.
Mm-hmm. And what has been, what has life like legislator been like? What have you enjoyed? What has been hard? What has been satisfying?
Yeah, I tell people if you have too much time and too much money, you should run for the legislature because it will take all of both.
Yeah, right.
I think that to me, it's very rewarding. I like the process. I look at the problems that exist in Louisiana. I believe that they're policy-based. I think if we were to fix the policies here, we have all the resources, we have everything we need to be in the top 10 in states in every list as opposed to in the bottom. But it's a struggle sometimes to get there. I mean, you have to convince people, you have to bring people on board. And I think I've been able to do that effectively in the legislature. At the same time, you're limited. You're only there 2 or 3 months out of the year. It's a part-time job. It's very difficult to balance, especially for a young guy, to balance the your professional life, your family life, and being in the legislature and politics. It's difficult. That is one of those struggles that you're always in, because you have, your real job that you got to balance while you're spending 2 months in the legislature. So I found that to be difficult. And I think most people in my shoes that are, younger, they're not retired, they're not rich, they actually have to work for a living. That's a struggle of being in the legislature. But, you really have the ability to influence change. I mean, more than even Congress or the president, you can really, in Louisiana, in the legislature, probably in any state legislature, you can really change people's lives. And I think most people don't appreciate the impact that the state government has on their lives. But, every crime, most taxes, everything that they pay, the roads they drive on, these are all controlled by the state legislature. It's not, or the state government. It's not a federal issue. The federal government can spend a lot of money. They can't solve a lot of problems. But on a state level, I think we can.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think also isn't appreciated, at least I didn't, about our state legislature is it's a part-time legislature. What do you think about that? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it limits some of what can get done?
I mean, I think it's fine to be part-time. I think that, honestly, I think that the pay should be higher so you could attract a more diverse group of people to come do it, and so that they're not just wealthy or retired. I don't think that makes the legislature very representative of the people and their problems. But I think the part-time nature, I don't think that is that big of a deal. For example, Texas, their legislature only meets every other year. So, we meet every year, but I think from a standpoint of, does the legislature need to be there all the time, and should that be their only focus? I don't think that that's necessary. But at the same time, I think that you really should have probably a higher salary that could attract, especially younger people, to come do it.
Right. And so you said you view most of the problems of Louisiana as policy problems. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what your biggest policy focuses have been during your time in the legislature?
Sure. So if Louisiana were just average, we'd all live 4 years longer and get a 33% raise, right? So that's kind of the measurements of how I look at, what are we doing and what direction do we need to go in. So when you look at states like next door to us, Texas, Florida, they've both been very, very successful. They have, higher life expectancy, higher incomes. And then especially they've been more successful at attracting people, even from Louisiana. So they grew 6 times faster than us in the last census until through 2020. And that's pre-COVID, when really they've seen even bigger growth since then. So the biggest differences that I see between us and those other states, which are, like I said, very similar to us as far as geography and people and stuff, is their tax system is just much more competitive. So they don't have a state income tax. That's one of the things that I promoted is, the elimination of the state income tax. And the other side of that coin is they handle most of their problems locally. Like, most of the money is doled out locally, it's raised locally, and it's prioritized locally. And I think that makes for much more effective government. And really what we have in Louisiana is a system that was built by Huey Long in the 30s that made, the governor at the center of everything, the state government at the center of everything. And so most local governments, most businesses, if they want to get anything done in Louisiana, have to go to the governor and to the legislature and beg. They will need some kind of tax credit. They need some kind of project that needs to be funded. In most other states, it doesn't work that way. We have local governments solving their own problems. If you need a road, if you need a school, if you need a bridge, they fix it locally. It's not something that you got to go beg and hope that your state rep can bring your tax money back to your district, right? And so those are things that I fought for, is kind of a complete revamp of the tax code to make it more competitive so we can attract businesses here, so we can attract people here, and then empowering local governments to really solve people's problems. I think those are 2 things that we have to do if you want Louisiana to close that gap. The second thing is education. I've worked a lot in education, especially in elementary literacy, trying to make sure kids can read. About half of our 3rd graders can't read on grade level. I've had a series of bills to try and address that, looking at ways around the country where similar states have been able to kind of climb from those bottom rankings to the top or the middle of that pack. And so I think education is one of those fundamental issues. Businesses aren't going to move here. People aren't going to move here if they don't think their kids are going to get a good education. And I think we've struggled with that for a long time. And so I think, finding, improving literacy, which I think we're on the right track. I think attracting high quality teachers is very critical. I think early child education, if you want to close the poverty gap between, the rich kids and the poor kids, we got a lot of poor kids in the state, and I think they need to, have a leg up in order to compete, and in order to, I think break this kind of generational cycle of poverty. I think early child education from, the time they're born till the time they walk into kindergarten, you can close a lot of those gaps, and I think the research shows that pretty concretely. So those are things that I think really need to happen, and what I fought for in the legislature.
Great. And I think, in terms of the relationship between those two issues, in terms of as we saw during the session, part of education, part of the solution is not just obviously money, but investments are an important part of it. And so I guess some of the critiques about the removal of the income tax are that would we lose money that we could then, would we lose revenue that we could then not invest in education, et cetera? And so how would you make up for the revenue that would be lost if we removed the income tax?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we actually spend 20% more per student on K through 12 education than any of our neighboring southern states, right? So we spend significantly more money on this. In reality, too, is that these other states that don't have an income tax, they actually function much better than us, right? Texas doesn't have an income tax, Tennessee doesn't have an income tax, Florida doesn't have one. So you just make up the revenue in other ways, especially in property taxes and sales taxes. So really most of the state revenue that gets lost, I think you make up through a larger sales tax, and you shift some of the sales tax that's now administered locally, you shift that to the state, and you shift the locals instead on more property taxes. So in most other states, property tax is responsible for most local government revenue. In Louisiana, we kind of shortchange that through a bunch of credits and exemptions and everything. And so what you really need to do to fix the tax system is you need to broaden the base of the property tax, you need to broaden the base of the sales tax so that you can get rid of the income tax. I mean, those things need to happen regardless of whether you get rid of the income tax or not, because having all these credits and exemptions, which you have in both the property tax and the sales tax, it makes the rates really high. We have the highest sales tax rate in the country. And that's a result of all these exemptions and also the reliance of locals on that tax versus property taxes. So the good thing too is when you have tax at a local level, you have a lot more control over them, right? If you don't like it, you can vote against it. You can vote against the mayor. You can vote against the parish council. If you don't like your income tax, it's very difficult for you to change on a state level. So you also don't get to choose where the money goes versus when it's locally administered, you have a lot more control.
And so speaking of that local control, I think one of the changes that Governor Edwards made in terms of the industrial tax program, I understand, is that he gave more control to the local municipalities to determine whether the exemptions are granted. And so would you maintain that change or would you make any other reforms to the tax exemption program?
Yeah, so I would maintain that change, but part of my tax plan is to actually phase that program out. And so let the locals administer it by themselves 100%, which is what it is in almost every other state. That's the ITEP program is about $1.3 to $1.5 billion a year, that credit that we give, mostly to large chemical manufacturers. At the end of the day, too, is what we're doing is we're competing against Texas for these projects. So Texas doesn't have a similar program, right? So getting rid of it doesn't really impact the competitiveness to locate it here, and it's really a lot of revenue that we give away. And especially, the problem with it, especially prior to Governor Edwards, was that, the state is giving away local revenue, right? That doesn't really make sense because the people that are writing the check are not the people that are cashing it, so I don't think that that's the best system. But that's part of the idea, to get rid of these credits and exemptions and really let locals handle their own problems. That's one way to do it. Is that makes up 1.3 or 1.5 billion of a total income tax take of about 4.2 or something like that. So it's a huge chunk of all the money we collect. If you compare it to the tax or the income tax, it's a huge piece and something that you got to look at.
Right, and then of course the other side of the financial situation at the state is not just the revenue, but then the expenditures. And so this year was a fiscal year at the state legislature, and I guess there was some controversy there has been some controversy, at least on Twitter, about how long it took to finally approve the budget. And so do you have any thoughts on both the budget process, as well as the final result? Are you happy with what was passed in terms of capital outlay, operational, et cetera?
I mean, I think it's indicative of the problems here, right? And so the reason it's so complicated is because there's so many local projects that legislators are fighting to add into the budget. So it's essentially local responsibilities that we're trying to put state money behind because the locals don't want to fund it, or they can't fund it themselves. And so that's where almost all of the controversy in the budget comes from. I think that the budget process is not clear. It's very opaque. And you also, most of the legislators, we got it like 30 minutes before. So it's a $2.2 billion budget. The final product, we saw 30 minutes before. You can't read through that. You can't see everything that's in there. And I mean, obviously, you don't agree with everything. It was a compromise to begin with between the House and the Senate. And, I'm one of 144. I'm not going to agree on everything they put in the budget. The broad strokes of it is like, is this something I can live with? I would say it's something that I can live with. I think we We resisted the urge to create a bunch of recurring expenses that I think would hold us back in the future. We paid down a significant, I think, a historical amount of pension debt, which is a huge, kind of a huge burden on the state. It's about 7.25% interest on $17 billion. So we paid down a piece of that, which I think is really important moving forward, that we don't carry this burden on and like pass it to our kids like, basically the previous generations have done with us. So I think we made a lot of good investments. I think we did some good things at the same time. I'm not happy with all of it. And, obviously it could have been done better. And I think really the biggest failure was that we didn't have enough time. Like it should have been passed earlier. It should have been, legislators should have been given time to go through it and ask questions, and that didn't happen.
Right. And what do you think about will happen with the $100 million cut to the LDH, the health department? I saw that Chairman Zerang yesterday, I think, or the day before, said that he expects the governor to veto it and then potentially veto other projects.
Things to offset the cut, yeah. I mean, I think that's possible. I mean, it's definitely possible. My understanding was that there's a significant amount of money that LDH will not be responsible for because the Medicaid rolls are set to shrink because some of these COVID programs are winding down. I don't know if $100 million offsets some of those losses or not, but I'm sure the governor can go through there with the veto pen and fix some of those problems. It was not something that was discussed with us prior to the budget being passed, which is an issue and kind of what we're talking about. But I think that there's ways to alleviate it, and we'll have opportunities before the end of the fiscal year next year to address it.
Right. And so before we talk more about your positive vision for governor, I saw one of your tweets, which I thought was pretty funny. I think sometime in the middle of session, it was when a bunch of the controversial bills were being discussed, and I think it was like a meme from maybe some war meme about when do I come back from the war, but it was when do I come back from the culture war, and you're like, this is what my life is thinking.
So it was like a lady, it was like a painting of a lady looking out the window, and she was like, when will my husband return from the culture wars?
Exactly. So why did you post that? What were your thoughts about the culture wars that took place during the legislature?
The thing about culture wars is nobody wins them. I mean, that's why politicians wage it all the time. It's like, it's not something that you can ever really win. It's a constant conflict that's really just divisive. In reality, Louisiana has real problems. The kids can't read. We don't have good jobs. Like we can't afford health care. We don't have great health care. Like these are all real problems. And so when I talk about, how do you fix Louisiana? What are the things that we're going to do? Like I never talk about the libraries and how, that's going to solve our problems, or any of these other things that are really just designed to divide people. That doesn't help at all. Doesn't teach one kid how to read. Doesn't give one parent a job. Doesn't pave a road. I mean, these are things that are real problems that we have to address. And every minute you spend talking about that is a minute that you're not spending solving the real problem. So, I hate the culture wars. I think it's a waste of time. Unfortunately, I think it's a national initiative that has come to Louisiana, where we've, I think, historically been more open-minded and, congenial versus trying to draw battle lines of them and us. But, this is the battle. This is what the voters have to decide, is what that matters to them. I mean, do you care about your kid reading? Do you care about, getting a good job? Or do you want to fight about all these other things?
Right. And one of the things I think that showed is, in terms of your point about how the legislature can be a little bit like the United Nations, that issue along with other issues, you see that although there's a Republican supermajority, or almost, I think there's a Republican supermajority in both houses, there's different, it's almost like there's multiple parties within that. Mm-hmm. And definitely it seemed like there was like a suburban Republican caucus a little bit that on some of the issues, not all of them obviously, there were different issues, but those issues as well as others, you see that there's break off and it's not as simple as Republican and Democrat.
Yeah, so you have Democrats that vote for some of that stuff and
right.
Republicans that vote against it, and it's really, I think, just based on more of the makeup of your district. Some of it might be generational too. I mean,
right.
You have different ideas about what's right and what's wrong, but especially I think that the rural and more urban areas, they just have different views on those things.
Right. And so to that point, what do you find that there's, other than obviously Republican and Democrat, if you were to name a few different factions or sub-parties within the House and the Senate, well, how would you qualify that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's Republicans is kind of a big group, and I think especially when you're in a supermajority, it's there's more infighting. The more there are of you, the harder it is for everybody to agree on things. I think you saw that in some of these budget fights, and it's a struggle sometimes to get everybody on board. It's herding cats, right? And so I think there's definitely like a very socially conservative group right? There's a larger, I think, fiscally conservative group in the Republicans. I think the Senate is hard to pin down. I mean, the Senate, they handle everything a little different. You know, in the House, we get on the floor and we, give big speeches and try and convince people and, fight big battles publicly. The Senate kind of handles everything in the back room. Like, everything's already decided when you show up whether or not it's going to, pass or fail. Generally, they're, I think, more organized and have a clear idea of where they want to go versus the House where it's really, I think, very democratic. Like, we're out there fighting for every vote. So the politics are different between the houses, but especially in the House, I think that there's definitely there's kind of the social conservatives, I think the broader fiscal conservatives. You have kind of the middle of the road moderates of the Republicans. And then you have the Democrats. I mean, even in the Democrats, like, I think the more rural Democrats, I think, are more likely to side with the Republicans on social issues. And I mean, honestly, everybody can agree on. There's a lot. 90% of the stuff that goes through the legislature gets a unanimous vote on everything, and so it's not controversial. We don't write about that because nobody cares. But most of the stuff is non-controversial, and it's just this very, minor 10% or so that we spend all our time on.
Right, and I think that's something people don't really appreciate is there is actually a significant amount of ideological diversity. And then also coalition building based off of that. That might be bipartisan in some ways, even though everything seems so bipartisan and divided. And the other thing that I thought was interesting is I feel like there's a significant, I think this is part of the legacy of Huey P. Long and Gov Edwards and the old style Democrats, where there's a socially conservative, fiscally more moderate, or even a little bit
Every
more
man
tax
a king.
and spend.
Yeah, every man a king. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, there is. I mean, half the guys in the legislature, they were Democrats 10 years ago or 15 years ago, right? So, I don't think their entire philosophy changed, when they became a Republican, 10 or 15 years ago. So, at the end of the day, some of them have been in Louisiana politics longer than I've been alive, for real. So, I think that it's hard to take that out of your decision making when you've been there for so long.
Right. And so then passing to the next step, what do you view, why did you decide to run for governor at this time?
So I think that there's an opportunity for Louisiana. I think that there's a desire among people that we need to do something different. I think people recognize, like, what we're doing isn't working. They continuously see, the young, smart people that are here that love Louisiana. They see them leaving the state, and they recognize that it's a time to do something different. And so for me, for me personally, I think I've been in the legislature for 4 years. I've seen how it works. I know the process now. I know a lot of the problems I've looked into. I've spent basically 4 years or 5 years really studying them deeply. And so I think I can implement the changes that we need. And honestly, I don't know that there's going to be another opportunity where you can get a mandate from the people of Louisiana to make the big changes that we need. If you want to get people that 4 years of their life and 33% raise, like, if you want to get them that back, it's going to take big changes, and it's going to take big ideas, and it's going to take people out there fighting for it. Young people are the ones who start revolutions. So I'm 37 right now. People tell me, well, wait until you're term limited in the legislature. Like, there's never been a time where a term limited, politician comes in and really changes things. That doesn't happen. I know enough to know what needs to be fixed and how to do it, and I think that's what you need. You can't be institutionalized and then go back and say, I'm going to try and fix it all. Right.
And how do you view your plan as different and or consistent with Governor Edwards' administrations and how he's run the state?
I'm not going to criticize the governor. I mean, I think he's had a tough shake. I mean, between COVID and all the hurricanes and everything, he's really almost been a crisis governor. Like, he's had all these problems that he's had to deal with. He took over from Bobby Jindal, who ran the state into the ground. The budget was a complete disaster. He didn't have time to implement big long-term changes when you're just trying to keep the lights on, which is what we were doing, I think, when he took over. I think that for me, I just have a long-term vision. Like, that's what I'm focused on, is not the next 4 years, the next 40 years. And I think that's what Louisiana is going to need. If you want to climb out of this, it's not going to happen overnight, but you have to lay the foundation for it today. I think the governor is really focused on, putting out fires, responding to these crises, and not kind of the long-term policy plan on how to make things better. And anytime you see me talk, whatever, I will fight every day for this long-term vision. This is how we fix the problem, and I think that's really what Louisiana needs.
Right. And so in terms of that long-term vision, you talked a little bit about education, the education side of things, and then you mentioned, obviously, the comparison with Texas and Florida. And obviously, one of the things that Texas and Florida really have is a much better economic development situation, better diversified economies. And so what do you view as the 10-year or 15-year long economic development vision for Louisiana? What are the different industries that will continue to exist? What are new industries that we should really be investing in?
Yeah, so I think that when you look at the states and not the areas that have grown and that are continuing to be, I think, really thriving places, you look at Austin and the Research Triangle, like it's really based around research-based universities, right? Like that's really what drives a lot of the innovation. They drive these kind of ecosystems. So I think that investing in research and STEM research in our universities, especially like LSU, UL, Virginia, or Louisiana Tech, I think that that's a way that we can really bring the jobs of the future here. I think that's the best economic development you can do, because you have these, if you attract these top-rate professors, if you build advanced laboratories and facilities there, they attract grad students, they get grants, like they all fund themselves, and then they all start doing spin-offs, and you create a whole, not just one company that you paid $1 million to come here. They create whole ecosystems where it's organic growth that will spread through the state. And I mean, honestly, we have a lot of good universities. We have a lot of capability to do things differently, and that's how you diversify the economy away from the same things that we've been doing since Huey Long. Like oil and gas is great. We shouldn't discourage it, but it's not going to be around forever, and we need to start looking to the future on how we're going to attract those. I had a bill last year in the legislature. It was called the SMART bill that basically was saying let's invest in building advanced laboratories. Let's invest in attracting top-rate faculty so that they can come here and do the research here and really grow these ecosystems out. And I think that's how you're going to change the future as well. I mean, it's not just the tax policy, it's not just the education system, it's putting those right pieces in place.
Right. And then you mentioned oil and gas, and I think obviously that's a key issue. There's not nearly as many jobs as there used to be in oil and gas. There will hopefully continue to be jobs, significant amount of jobs, but not enough to make up for the gap that has been lost. And so what do you view, do you think there's other energy industry opportunities for Louisiana, whether it's nuclear or there's been some bills about offshore wind? How do you view the global energy strategy for Louisiana?
I mean, I think Louisiana should look at all of the above. I mean, I think nuclear, if you're looking at the way to actually solve the problem, I think nuclear could solve it overnight, right? I mean, if we all got on board with it, the problem is that it's really tied up in federal regulatory mess that makes it very difficult to bring a new power plant here. But I mean, that's obviously carbon-free, lasts forever. It's just kind of a difficult way to implement. It's just a difficult piece to get started. The offshore wind, I mean, we've had a lot of bills on that in the legislature. I think it's a good idea. I think as long as private capital is willing to invest in anything, like we should create the mechanisms to allow that. And I think that when you look at where the future is going to go, I think renewables are going to play a big role in that. Solar is, I think, a booming industry now in Louisiana as well. They have solar farms all over the place. Sometimes they're controversial just because it's a change. But we need to look at how do we power the Louisiana of the future, and I think those are the ways that's the way to get there. I mean, oil and gas, we should sell it to the extent we can, especially when you look at like a country like Norway. They make a ton of money off selling natural gas, or oil and natural gas, but they invest it in their country. They invested in trying to bring in the jobs of the future. I think that's what we have to look at.
Right. And then in terms of one of the other reasons we need the revenue from the energy industry, including oil and gas, is not just to invest in the people in the communities, but also to invest in the environment, and a lot of the coastal restoration work is in fact funded by the Go Mesa revenues, et cetera. And so what would be your plan in terms of the coastal restoration plan? It seems that Governor Edwards has really made an impact in kind of following up on the legacy and working with people like Garrett Graves, et cetera. It's been a bipartisan issue, but it seems like there has been a bit of a turning point, that now there's more optimism and there's more work being done. And so how do you view that fight in terms of protecting the coast and rebuilding the coast?
So we have a coastal master plan, right? And it's a $50 billion, I think, 50-year plan or something like that gets reauthorized every 5 years. We just voted for it in the legislature. It was unanimous. Everybody agrees. Like, this is our, basically scientifically researched best practices. This is what we're going to do. This is where all the projects we're going to put the money in. And the issue, and really where the rubber meets the road, is where are you going to get the money? Right now we get it from the BP oil spill, and we get it from the Go Mesa money, which is the federal offshore revenues, right? The BP oil money is going to dry up, I think, in 2032, and so you're not going to have that as a source of revenue. So what you have to do is really grow the economy so that you can do these critical, projects that are saving the coast. At the end of the day, the state, we compare ourselves to other states. Other states aren't falling in the Gulf of Mexico. This is an existential problem for us that we have to solve. We can't rely on the federal government for all the money. I mean, I think most people you ask, they'll be like, oh, we got to get more money for the federal government. Federal government's got $31 or $32 trillion in debt that they're all going to have to, be paying trillions of dollars in interest on. We can't count on them to save us. I think the era of federal largesse and them coming to bail us out is not going to continue in the future. So we have to be able to save ourselves. And I think having this kind of diversified and competitive economy is where you build the tax base to pay for those things, which are critical, that everybody agrees on. It's just we have to find a way to pay for it.
Right. And then, what are your thoughts on the one opportunity that might be realistic in terms of getting more federal funds is the effort to move from the 37.5% to the 50%, I imagine.
Yeah. Everybody, I mean, everyone's going to support that except for the rest of the country that now, it's a pay increase for us and it's a pay cut for them. And like I said, when you have $31 or $32 trillion in debt that now you're financing at 6% interest, right? That's a lot that they're going to have to pay. And I don't know that they're going to be able to give up the hundreds of millions of dollars to send to Louisiana when they're looking at those kind of budget problems, which is, you see that in multiple things. Louisiana has a shrinking population, which means we have shrinking congressional representation, which means our ability to influence some of these things gets less and less. So we lost a congressman in 1990. We lost another congressman in 2010. We're going to lose another one in 2030 if we don't reverse these population trends. And relying on the federal government is going to get harder and harder as you continue to lose representation.
Right. And something I appreciate with your approach to these issues is that, and that relates to what we do, is the stakes are high and the situation is dire to some extent, whether we look at economics or population or environmental, and in what we do in terms of the culture and the language. And so those were my kind of last few questions I wanted to ask you is, obviously something very dear to hearts is the effort to keep French alive in Louisiana and how that can be part of the solution in terms of creating a cultural economy, creating a bilingual workforce. And so as governor, how would you support French in Louisiana? Would you be an advocate for bilingual education and keeping our unique Cajun and Creole culture alive?
Absolutely. I think honestly, with the coastal land loss, that's part of the problem, is that it's really the things that make Louisiana the most unique place in the country. That's what's disappearing. And so I think the French language and I think the Cajun Creole culture is one of the things that as soon as you talk about Louisiana, that pops into their heads, right? It really separates us from everywhere else. I think, what is it, Tennessee Williams, he said there's 3 cities in America, right? It's San Francisco, New York, and then New Orleans, right. And everywhere else is Cleveland. And so I think that, New Orleans is very unique. I think kind of this Cajun culture and the uniqueness of Louisiana is something that is one of the best assets. It's like one of the soft assets, right? It's not oil and gas. You can't pump it. You can't really sell it as like an item, but I think it's really one of the things that attracts people here, and it's really what makes us unique. It would be a tragedy for that to go away. So I've also lived overseas. I've lived overseas. I know the benefit, I think, of just having that. I think it gives you a more worldly view when you speak French or any other language, and so I think embracing that as part of our culture is a way to, I think, make Louisiana a better place. I think gives us a competitive edge over other places that really don't have that. No matter what you do, like Austin will never have the culture Louisiana has. Houston will never have the culture we have. Orlando will never have that. And so what we need to do is take these things that are really our strengths. And instead of using it as a crutch on bad policy, you got to use it as a competitive advantage so that we can get ahead.
Right, and I think exactly like you're saying, people talk a lot about the advantages in terms of tourism and also even in terms of international commerce and maybe attracting French businesses, but I think people underappreciate how much, in terms of that pitch you're talking about earlier, obviously taxes and education, when families are deciding where to move, those are probably the most important issues, but the culture really can be a deciding factor of why someone would move to Thibodaux or Houma or Lafayette. Instead of maybe a similar sized city in another part of the state.
Absolutely. I've been all over the world. You will never find better or more friendly people than in Louisiana. And I think that's something that everybody notices. I think from the time they get off the plane here, they're like, these are the friendliest people in the world. It doesn't matter where you're from or what your notions were before you got here. And I think that will attract people here. When you fix these other problems that are really, I think, the fundamental issues, we will outcompete anybody. Like I said, Houston and Orlando will never beat us on culture, which is something that is really critical for, I think, a quality of life once you address these other issues.
Right. Yeah. I always say there's no better place to live once we deal with the problems that we can solve, because the culture we can't. That's the nice thing that we have.
You can't buy. That's the thing you can't buy. You can't legislate the value of what Louisiana brings to the table as far as culture, but you can fix the actual policy problems, which are, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can look around at other states and see what works, and then you can use those other things as a competitive advantage.
Right. So there's reasons to be optimistic. So finally, what's next for you? What is your day-to-day like in the coming weeks? How are you going to win the election?
Yeah, so I mean, we're out working hard. I mean, I don't have a ton of money, unfortunately, so I travel the state, I meet people, I speak to people. That's where I win. I think, most people, when I go and sit down and talk to them, the first question is, how old is this guy, right? Like, they see
relate.
me. Yeah, they see me and they're like, oh, well, he's probably, 18 or 25 or something. So, I'm 37, so I think you have to break down that barrier. Most people, though, end up being very, I think, positively affected by my age. I think I have a pretty extensive experience, even though I'm young. And I think, too, is that I really think that Louisiana can be fixed. I think we can use the things that we do well as an advantage, and I think we can fix the policy problems here, and that would just change the game forever. Louisiana has all the resources. We have the most opportunity of any state in the country. Unfortunately, we've had that for the last 100 years, and we've done nothing about it. So I think you fix these policy problems, Louisiana will, I think, soar, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I think people understand that, and that's where I just have to get around and get that message out.
Sounds good. Well, I think that's a good optimistic note to end on.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I think we can fix it. Everything can be fixed. It just takes, a little bit of courage and a lot of work.
Right, exactly. And I think there's a lot more to be optimistic about than we expect. It's just a lot of work to be done. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you so much,
Representative
Nelson,
thanks
for
for having
making the time for us. And then good luck with the rest of the campaign.
Yeah,
we'll
thank you.
definitely keep in touch.
Good deal.
Cool. A bientôt.